Opponent ready? Judge ready? Timekeeper ready? Alright, I'd like to begin. It's not enough to believe in something, you have to be ready to stand for something if you want change. Edward Snowden. Is because I agree with that statement and compelled to affirm today's topic, civil disobedience and democracy is morally justified. For clarification of today's round, I offer the following definitions. Civil, adequate in courtesy and politeness. Disobedience, refusal or neglect to obey. Moral, concerning or relating to what is right and wrong in human behavior. Civil disobedience, refusal to obey governmental demands or commands, especially as non-violent and usually collective means of forcing concessions from the government. Democracy, a system of government in which people choose their rules by voting for them in elections. Republic, a state in which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, and which has an elected and nominated president rather than a monarch. Corrupt, dishonest, or fraudulent conducted by those in power, typically involving bribery. Immoral, not conforming to accepted standards of morality for the better, so as to produce improvement, works to function or operate according to plan or design. Indispensable, absolutely necessary. Liberty, freedom from arbitrary or despotic control. Despot, a ruler with absolute power or an authority. Arbitrary, not restrained or limited in the exercise of power. Justified, having or shown a just, right, or reasonable bias. These definitions are from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, Collins Dictionary, Macmillan Dictionary, and the Google Dictionary. For further clarification of today's round, I'd like to set the precedents and make clear what the resolution states. Civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. Therefore, it counts as civil disobedience, and anything that happens outside of democracy shouldn't be considered for today's round. This applies to countries such as the United States of America, which is, according to the U.S. Embassy, the United States is more accurately defined as a constitutional federal republic. This does not apply to examples that have to do with the United States invalid, but anything that implies that happens within that is not considered democracy, take this into consideration when examining mine or my opponent's arguments. The highest value in today's round is the value of democracy. Democracy, the form of government that may be direct or representative. Democracy maintains four key elements: individualism, liberty, equality, and fraternity. The best criterion for the value is categorical imperative, which is the principle advanced by Kant, which contends that there are some universal laws which exist for all beings. Moral actions then are only those acts of the individual in which he or she should want to be universal law. Universal law can be defined as rule of behavior that all people should follow. My first contention is that civil disobedience works. Starting in December 2018, a movement emerged which eventually brought millions of Sudanese onto the street. By April 2019, General Omar al-Bahir was overthrown by fellow military officers. Protests continued despite hundreds of additional deaths. By August, the military stepped down in favor of a civilian-led transitional government. The choice of peaceful protests, sit-in strikes made it difficult for the regime to depict the movements in negative light. And nonviolence meant that this movement attracted sympathy it would have lost through violent tactics. This swelled the number of people coming out onto the streets when the turbulent and often tragic history of the past decade in North Africa, written in the 2019 pro-democracy revolution in Sudan, will likely be considered one of the few bright spots of one of the world's most brutal dictatorships. First contention, subpoint B. Circulating pamphlets and petitions were early campaigning activities, with the MNSWS holding the first public meeting at the Manchester Free Trade Hall on the 14th April 1868, considered by some to mark the beginning of the suffrage campaign. Resolutions were proposed by Lydia Beckett, Agnes Pochin, and Anne Robertson. It was a significant occasion since it was rare for women to speak publicly at the time, and more suffragists were jailed. However, the NUWSS became increasingly concerned that militancy was detrimental to the cause. The NUWSS remained committed to a peaceful campaign mostly carried out through drawing rooms and public meetings around the country, yet they also began organizing peaceful demonstrations to prove what they felt effectiveness on non-military. With banners flying and accompanying marching bands, they would gather at Trafalgar Square along Embankment and begin a procession which would end the Albert Hall or other various destinations. Soon World War I began and all efforts changed toward the war. However, their actions were not in vain. Shortly after the war concluded, women were granted the vote in the UK. First contention, subpoint C. Estonia had endured foreign occupation for centuries, joined by the fellow Baltic Republic of Latvia and Lithuania, in a non-violent movement that enabled them to become independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. Beginnings in the mid-1980s, Estonians began taking advantage of their unique and rich cultural traditions, particularly in choral music, to encourage a national reawakening. Estonians gathered in thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands to celebrate the heritage and song in what became known as the Singing Revolution, raising the abandoned Estonia flag with gathering masses and singing banded patriotic songs. The movement eventually gained the support of the Republic's ruling Communist Party in defying Moscow, faced down Soviet tanks, and successfully declared Estonian independence. My second contention is that civil disobedience is needed for change within a corrupt government. Second contention is that according to the 2021 Corruption Perception from the Transparency website and organization, in 2021 the global average remains unchanged for the 10th year in a row at just 43 out of a possible 100 points. Despite multiple committees 131 countries have made no significant progress against corruption in the last decade. 2/3 of countries score below 50, indicating that they have serious corruption problems.
You're done.
No!
You're so
No!
So now you stand open for cross-six.
No! I was gonna change.
It's all good. So
I hate
what we'll do now is
Let's do this.
same thing, 2 minutes of cross-examination. So you say judge ready, timekeeper ready, not ready.
In your first contention, all 3 of your subpoints are talking about different examples of civil disobedience and how they worked in their government, correct?
Yes.
So-
Within a democracy.
Yes.
Or formed a democracy.
Yes. So your second contention, you say 131 cases of different governments in a very recent study said that they had not made significant changes towards like changing corruption.
By all within the government of like voting, corruption, and stuff like that.
So if your first contention, just to clarify, your first contention is that civil disobedience works.
Yes.
And then your second contention, your first subpoint, at least what you got to read of it, was that it has not shown statistically that it is working.
In countries that haven't shown civil disobedience.
That's all.
Anyway.
Do you want to use any prep time?
Just 1 second.
I was about to float it for you. Oh, I messed up.
Okay, I'm ready. Judge ready?
Ready?
Timekeeper?
So she's gonna get 6 minutes.
Yes. Timekeeper?
Yes.
Opponent?
Yeah.
Okay. Before we begin, I want to thank our judge and timekeeper as well as my opponent and our audience for the opportunity to speak today. Today I'll be negating our resolution that civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified, meaning that I'll be arguing that civil disobedience is not morally justified in a democracy. My definitions, I'll accept my opponents for civil disobedience, democracy, and moral, and I'll add riot and criminal law, a violent offense against public order involving 3 or more people. It will involve the gathering of persons for an illegal purpose, and it will also involve violence from Encyclopedia Britannica. I'll add disrespect to show or express disrespect or contempt for, and to add on to that one, I'll define contempt, an act of disobedience or disrespect towards the judicial branch of government or an interference with its orderly process, which will come from the U.S. Department of Justice archives. And I will also add general population, an entire population of individuals with a characteristic of interest from the Encyclopedia of Behavioral Medicine. My value today will be morality, the principles and standards set by a society for people evaluating the rightness and wrongness of acts. My criterion under morality will be deontology, a philosophical perspective based on the concept that acts or rules are acceptable based on their ability to satisfy overriding moral principles. My first contention is that civil disobedience leads to a disrespect of democracy itself. There are 4 main duties that a citizen has in the U.S., although it should be noted that the U.S. is not necessarily the definition of a perfect democracy. The U.S. is a democracy that tends to set trends and be followed by the rest of the world. Those 4 duties are registering with a selective service, serving jury duty when called, paying taxes, and obeying the law. For a person to knowingly break the law is for them to fail to meet 1/4 of their civic duty, which means that civilly disobedient people are failing to meet one of the only 4 requirements for being a productive citizen, and are furthermore ignoring the fact that laws can be changed without civil disobedience. Democracy was made to rely on its court system. The idea that the people decide, or a jury, must be kept true for a democracy to achieve its intended purpose and live up to its definition. Civil disobedience undermines that. My second contention is that that conviction does not equal correctness. Mark Twain said, just because you're taught that something's right and everyone believes it's right, don't make it right. If a person believes in the wrong thing with extreme conviction and they refuse to follow laws that unequivocally benefit the general population and or get other people to do the same thing, there is a major problem with their disobedience. Our outlook on the world is learned behavior, and that includes love and acceptance as well as hatred and prejudice. When people are allowed to project hateful opinions in ways that state them as fact, they are allowed to make other people learn the behavior that they did. An example of this is in the 1950s. In Little Rock, 9 black teenagers went to a white high school. They were the first to do so, and they faced extreme opposition, mostly from white parents. These parents stood outside of the school with signs protesting their attendance to that school. They were protesting an entire group of people's basic rights, fully believing that they were right. And had they succeeded in their goal of prohibiting black people from schools, integration as we know it would not exist. No matter how passionate they were about their cause, history did prove that those civilly disobedient people were incorrect. My third contention is escalation to violence. While civil disobedience is not by definition violent, violence and civil disobedience can often go hand in hand. Good intentions can very easily be overshadowed by bad ones, meaning that a group of people who truly do have good intentions and beliefs can very easily be seen as bad because of a few extremists in their group. It only takes one person taking it too far in the wrong direction to lead the entire group in the wrong direction. An example of this is in 2020. After the death of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests broke out all over America. Not to be mistaken, Black Lives Matter itself is a legitimate organization with legitimate goals and beliefs. However, when people joined their protests who were not like-minded, riots broke out. People on both sides were killed, tear-gassed, and robbed, and while the riots were egged on by police, media, and other factors, these riots took protests from calls for peace to visions of terror that anyone that watched the news in 2020 will never be able to forget. When civil disobedience and violence go hand in hand so often, it's not acceptable to argue the morality of one without acknowledging its butterfly effect towards the other, which is why, in spite of the fact that violence is not in the definition of civil disobedience, it is important to bring up. I'll finish by summing up all my points today. My first contention purpose was to put civilly disobedient people off of the pedestal that the affirmative side of this argument has to put them on in order to argue. People who are civilly disobedient are held to the same rule of law as everyone else, and the second that they become civilly disobedient, they become criminals, regardless of their moral standing. My second and third contentions point towards the other big issue with civil disobedience: human error. People can have good intentions when entering a peaceful protest, and that protest can still turn into something violent, or even worse, those people could just be plain wrong and protesting the wrong thing. Therefore, all things considered, civil disobedience cannot be absolutely morally justified, as the resolution states. And as far as my affirmative opponents, I only have 2 points to counteract theirs. Number one, I do want to point out that there was only 1.5 contention that was said. So please don't let the affirmative bring up a third contention. And I also want to point out that their second contention, or at least the part that was able to be read, did disprove the first. The first contention was that civil disobedience works. And the second contention talks about how statistically civil disobedience did not work in 131% of cases, or 131 cases. That's all.
So, that's a round. We'll have 3 minutes across examination. Start with the affirmative. You ready?
Cross-excerpt. Judge ready? Timekeeper ready? Opponent ready? Okay, what was your second contention?
My second contention was that conviction does not equal correctness.
Okay. And the third contention was?
My third contention was escalation of violence.
Escalation of violence, alright. First contention?
Civil disobedience leads to disrespect of democracy itself.
Do you have a definition for disrespect?
Oh, yes, I do. To show or express disrespect or contempt for, and then to further define that one, my definition for contempt was an act of disobedience or disrespect towards the judicial branch of government or an interference with its orderly process.
What type of branch of government are we talking about?
Judicial.
Judicial branch, okay. And with, what court system are you talking about too? And like, for your case of your first contention, you were talking about, was it first or second? One of your contentions you were talking about, the court system?
Yes, I say that democracy is built on the fact that the people are able to decide, which in your definition of democracy, you also said that the power is held by elected representatives. So if people are elected to serve as a judge, and or in some cases we have citizens who are held as a jury, which is what democracy is built on, then democracy relies on that court system. And if people are civilly disobedient, then they're undermining that court system.
Okay. That's it.
Okay. You need any prep time, Av?
No.
Okay. What is gonna be your roadmap? Your roadmap? Are you gonna go on, you're gonna extend your arguments and then go attack hers, or you're gonna start with her?
Extend a bit
And then go,
and again attack.
just signpost for me when you transition, okay?
Alright, I'd like to clarify for, Judge ready.
So Marvin gets 4 minutes and 3 minutes, so he's gonna get 3 minutes and 2 minutes
Yep.
for his rebuttals.
Timekeeper ready.
Yes.
Judge ready.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to begin. For my second contention, I am talking about corruption in a democracy and democracies around the country, and each of them have, well, yes, 131 of those countries have not shown any sign of progress. They do not show any signs of progress because there has been no signs of civil disobedience. And in, going off of that, addressing in the, wait, where is it? I'm trying to find it. I lost it. Oh well, that probably messed me up. Oh, I'm just gonna switch to attacking.
Okay.
Now, within my opponent's entire speech, she does state everything is like, not everything, but mostly everything in their speech was directed about civil disobedience, partaking in America, and stuff within that system of being America. And America, by the U.S. Embassy itself, has gone and stated that America itself is not a democracy, and it is actually a republic, and that's not what we're debating about today. And we're actually debating about democracies, and their civil disobedience works inside a democracy, and it's more collected inside a democracy, which is not what America is. And America is a republic, which is a state in which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, and which has an elected or nominated president rather than a monarch. While democracy is a system of government in which people choose their rulers by voting for them in elections. While they sound similar, republics and democracies are different, and I'd like to say that this round today is about democracies and not republics. So that classifies for all other republics, not just the United States, but mainly the United States. As well as that while civil disobedience itself isn't violent, and that if you accepted my definition for civil disobedience, which is the refusal to obey governmental demands or commands, especially as nonviolent and usually collective means for forcing concessions. And today we're debating the fact of is the protests themselves and the civil disobedience themselves within a democracy morally justified or not. And yeah, I'd like to end time.
In time? Stop there. Okay. And then, Nag, you have 4 minutes on your rebuttal speech. Are you, you need any prep time, or are you ready to go?
I think I'm ready.
Okay. Well, are you gonna go, can you give me a quick roadmap? Are you going on case and off case, or are you gonna go?
I'm just gonna address everything that he said in the order that I heard it.
Okay.
Timekeeper, Judge,
I'm ready.
Bonnet.
Yeah.
Okay. Your first point, you said that your second contention, you further clarified that it, the reason that those 131 cases did not work or show change from a corrupt government is that civil disobedience was not shown. And I do want to point out that as my first contention states, civil disobedience is not the only way to move away from a corrupt government. So I'd like that to be thrown out because civil disobedience is not the only way, and therefore we can't say that civil disobedience or lack thereof is the reason that those 131 countries did not change from the corrupt governments. I also want to say that the U.S., for all intents and purposes, even though they are not an example of a perfect democracy, is officially a democracy as it has always been taught. And I did clarify in my point that although America is not the perfect definition of a democracy, the U.S. is a democracy that does set trends for the rest of the world. And so most of my points do talk about the U.S. because the U.S. is a democracy that sets those trends. And then you attacked my third contention, which is escalation of violence, by saying that violence, because it's not in the definition of civil disobedience, should be thrown out. And I do want to say that I also addressed that in my original speech. Civil disobedience is not violence. However, they do go hand in hand, and it's not acceptable morally it's not acceptable to debate the morality of civil disobedience without talking about the fact that it does lead to violence a lot of the time. Because that's just not the way that the world works. We do have to acknowledge the things that come from our actions, and so while civil disobedience can lead to some good things happening, it does also lead to violence sometimes, and that does have to be considered. That's all.
And then F, you got one more speech for 2 minutes.
All right.
Your last and final rebuttal round.
Opponent ready? Timekeeper ready?
Yes.
Judge ready?
I'm ready.
All right, I'd like to begin with starting with my opponent on corruption and stating how there are other ways to fight corruption within a democracy and without the use of civil disobedience. If those ways of fixing it would be voting and trying to get better elected officials within, you can't expect the place itself to change if the system itself is corrupt. How can you fix a corrupt system if what through the output you're trying to fix something is corrupt itself? That's what the civil disobedience is for. Those laws were made by the corrupt officials who are still running the government. So how can we use those laws that are corrupt in itself to fix corrupt laws? You can't use corruption to fix corruption. That's why through civil disobedience, you're getting rid of the middleman of the government and going straight to the main government. And civil disobedience helps better with corruption because you're not working through the corruption of the voting system and everything else has to go on with the elected representatives and officials. That's still all corrupt. How can you fix that system when everything in it is corrupt? And I'd also like to say there that while America, you said that America was an example of, it's not a perfect example of democracy, but imperfect, I think was the word. Example of, not imperfect, but something like that. I forget, I didn't write it down, I'm sorry. But democracy, but America, America, by the U.S., the Embassy of America, official source of America, states that America itself is a republic, and a republic isn't a democracy, and that's what we're kind of talking about today. And while it may seem like one, and like very similar to one, it's not.
It's time. All right, good job. Give it a round.
Can I stop recording?
And then we can end it there.
Okay.